Alright, I'm back with some more spreadsheets and stats, and in this video we are taking a look at the semi-automatic rifles and DMRs. We'll be taking a look at how they perform statistically in various categories that are meant to represent relevant gameplay situations that these weapons might face. Some of these stats are made by me, some are from community resources, and some are based on testing of the weapons. We will go through each category and discuss the weapons as we go, but we'll also attempt to give an overall score for the weapons at the end of the video. So to start, we'll take a look at RECOIL, which includes stats like controllability, predictability, follow-up shot ability, and time to reset. Then it's Ergo with evolved ergonomics, handling, various tests of Ergo influence, so ADS time, arm stamina, etc., magazine size and Ergo penalties from magazines, and reload time. Then it's on to damage. We'll look at time to kill against various armors and damage drop-off. Then there is a little bit of overlap between damage and the next main category, which is ranged performance, where we will look at headshot kill range, which is very useful for these weapons. We'll look at 80% headshot accuracy range, 0% headshot range, so the range after which we cannot kill with a one-shot headshot anymore, and fast accurate shot to target and general accuracy. These categories and their subcategories should give us a very good idea of a weapon's performance, and we'll select a few of the most central subcategories to make a normalized overall score, and then finally look at an overall ranking and reflect a bit on the different weapons as overall choices. Again, like we've stated before, there is no overall best in Tarkov, arguably. All weapons are viable if you play to their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. This is just to help give some idea of what exactly those strengths and weaknesses are, and then you can incorporate the weapons that fit your playstyle accordingly. The base weapon stats are based on meta weapon builds, aiming for a good balance of low recoil and good ergonomics. The base preference of mine has been as low recoil as possible without getting into overswing by sacrificing too much ergo. There are obviously variations to how people build their guns, so it's very possible to build for slightly lower recoil in some cases and slightly better ergonomics in others than what I've done here. But the relative performance is what we are looking at, so I've built the guns with the same preference consistently, which is my own obviously, so that the comparisons are as fair as they can be, as building different guns with entirely different preferences would have a massive impact on the statistical results and therefore complicate our ability to compare the guns fairly. We are going to be using a lot of the same approaches and methods as in the previous video, which covered the assault rifles. Go watch that video if you're curious about assault rifles. I will include explanations of stats and game systems as I go in this video as well. This does mean I might repeat some of the same info from the previous video. I have tried to keep it as concise and straightforward as possible, but if you already know something, then feel free to skip around the video a little bit. I'll try to include some good chapter markers for you. But I want people who are watching this as their first video to have all the necessary information in this video and not having to go watch some other video to understand what I'm talking about in this one. So let's start by taking a look at recoil. Now, recoil is simultaneously easier but also trickier when dealing with semi-automatic weapons, because there is no set fire rate that is modifying it. The recoil is instead modified by a dynamic fire rate based on how fast you tap, which is going to vary depending on what kind of a scenario you are in. However, in Tarkov, the semi-automatic fire function has a hard cap of 450 RPM for all weapons. And this means that all the single-fire rifles and DMRs have a theoretical max fire rate of 450 RPM. I tested my own click speed out of curiosity, and averaging out my fast tapping speed, I averaged 7.2 clicks a second. And this adds up to a fire rate of 432 RPM, which is very close to the 450 cap. So because the 450 RPM equals to roughly 7.5 clicks per second, which is just slightly higher, we are just going to use the 450 RPM as our RPM across all the weapons for this video, as it is not much higher than what is actually achievable for an average player, and it will likely for some players be a cap they can actually hit. As myself, when clicking as fast as possible, did get higher than 7.5 clicks per second and 450 RPM in some of my attempts, and I'm nothing special. Now, it's important to note here as well that there is no click buffer in Tarkov, so your inputs can get passed over when you click faster than the 450 RPM, which means if you click too early, it won't fire because it hasn't reset yet. So it instead goes off of your first input after it's reset. And this can actually make it very hard to actually hit the 450 cap in the game, because unless your inputs are actually perfect on or right after cooldown, the game will kind of cheat you out of clicks and therefore prevent you from getting the 450 RPM. For recoil and controllability, because fire rate is practically the same, we could just ignore it and just look at recoil, but keeping it in is just multiplying by the same constant for all the weapons, so it's not really going to affect the results anything. It also allows us to use the same formulas as the other weapon categories we have and will be testing in the future, and therefore it allows us to compare weapons across categories as well as videos in this case, which I think is quite useful. So therefore we are going to include it, just know that it doesn't really impact the results anything. We're going to look at recoil mainly in the form of controllability. And with the DMRs, just like the assault rifles, we are going to split this into initial burst controllability and continuous fire controllability. First up, initial burst controllability. Now this is based on a weapon's recoil stats, and in the IBC formula, we weigh vertical recoil more than horizontal, since vertical recoil is the main contributor to recoil behavior in that initial spray. We do add an exponent to it to reflect that going from 20 to 30 recoil is a smaller change than going from 50 to 60 in terms of feel. Higher per shot recoil will also introduce more room for error when you are compensating for said recoil, as there is a lot more counteractive movement needed, and this is even more the case with high recoil when compensating for shots at longer distances. So the lower the result in IBC, the more controllable the weapon is. To no surprise, 545 and 556 are going to beat out the bigger calibers here. The TX15 winning by a small gap down to number 2. The SAG, the ADAR, and the SAG short take 2nd, 3rd, and 4th respectively, all suppressed as well. This is obviously thanks to the increased recoil reduction available from suppressors compared to loud muzzle devices for these calibers. The 308s and 762s actually have better muzzle devices available for recoil reduction unsuppressed compared to suppressed. As a result, the loud 308s and loud 762s will on average perform better in recoil than their suppressed versions. Another thing that adds to this is that because these caliber weapons, 308s and 762s, generally will have bigger problems with Ergo and Evo Ergo due to just being bigger and heavier guns, and a lot of the time also lacking modability, and because they sometimes have different barrel lengths available, you might need to go with a shorter barrel to cancel out the ergo penalty from going suppressed. And longer barrels, generally speaking, give you more recoil reduction. The fairly surprising one here is the SKS, I would say, being the best loud rifle. While having a few more vertical recoil than the weapons placing around it, it has a very low horizontal recoil, actually the lowest one of all the guns. The rest of the placings are fairly predictable and scaling very similarly to their recoil values. And this is again, like I mentioned earlier, because we are using the same static fire rate for all the guns here to get a fair comparison, as we are looking at raw controllability. So IBC covers the initial part of a burst. Now let's look at controllability after recoil stabilizes, because as you probably know, the recoil in Tarkov stabilizes vertically after a certain amount of vertical movement. This seems to be based on a total recoil sum in a given time period, because the M1A, for example, only takes 3 shots before it starts stabilizing. Some other weapons take 5 to 7 shots. So after a certain amount of shooting, the vertical recoil is affecting recoil way less than it was in the beginning of a spray. And this is where continuous fire controllability, or CFC, comes in, where horizontal recoil is a much bigger factor. Horizontal recoil and vertical recoil functions quite differently in Tarkov. Vertical recoil is the same amount for every bullet, but horizontal recoil is not a static value per shot. Instead, the horizontal recoil value represents a range, and for each shot, you are assigned a random value within this range, which will be your actual horizontal recoil for that shot. It is also random whether this value is to the left or to the right horizontally. So to help visualize how this works, we'll put a visualization on screen. Obviously, this visualization is not accurate to what it would actually look like in-game during gameplay, but it should give you some idea of how much randomness the horizontal recoil introduces. Now, since vertical recoil is consistent and learnable, and it also stabilizes during prolonged fire, but horizontal recoil is unpredictable and reactive, we've weighed horizontal recoil twice as much as vertical recoil in the formula for CFC. We've also added a mild exponent to the sum, just like with IBC, to account for the increased amount of compensation needed, and the room for error also increasing the higher the recoil. The SKS has the biggest, most notable jump here, carried by its low horizontal recoil, which is going to help keep it controllable during continued fire. We do have a lot of these same contenders as with IBC, the suppressed TX15, the SAG, ADAR, SAG short, and also the suppressed SKS place very well. Interestingly, some of the 308s also come creeping up the list now, with the SR25 with a 20-inch barrel and the RSAS with a 22-inch barrel slipping past the loud short SAG and ADAR. Again, benefiting from the low horizontal, and due to vertical recoil being reduced during prolonged shooting, their slightly higher vertical doesn't really ruin it for them. The G28 really suffers here despite having the same vertical recoil as the 22-inch RSAS, since its horizontal is just so much higher. The 20-inch barreled loud SR25 is across both IBC and CFC the most controllable 308 overall. Next, we will take a look at a weapon's predictability. By dividing vertical recoil by horizontal recoil, we can get a good idea of how predictable a gun's recoil behavior is. If a weapon has good predictability, it has a low amount of horizontal recoil, which is random, compared to its vertical recoil, which is consistent. So in effect, it has a less random and more predictable recoil behavior. A weapon with good predictability, therefore, has a narrower and taller recoil pattern, with recoil going mainly upwards, where a bad predictability weapon will have a shorter and wider recoil pattern, where recoil goes more side to side. The MK18, with its massive amount of per shot recoil, does sit at the top here, following the trend that we have found, where higher vertical recoil weapons usually have a proportionately smaller amount of horizontal recoil, likely as a way to balance low and high recoil weapons, as higher vertical recoil weapons have the disadvantage of high recoil, but the advantage of a more predictable recoil, while also usually doing more damage per shot as well. And the low vertical recoil weapons, while having the obvious advantage of lower recoil, have a more unpredictable recoil. But due to the higher amount of total recoil, higher vertical recoil weapons are still going to be harder to control, obviously. The MK18 is not alone at the top though. The M1A sits at roughly the same score as the MK18, these two being the only two weapons in this category to have a vertical recoil higher than 50% of its horizontal. The M1A does well, likely due to also having a lot of recoil, but not entirely, because other weapons have comparable or even more recoil in some cases and have worse predictability. Especially the loud 22-inch M1A has a really good predictability relative to the amount of vertical recoil it has, which is a relationship we will look at next. The M1A unfortunately suffers from, while having a lot of mods and different stocks and chassis, etc., it doesn't really have a lot of good ones, and it struggles in most other categories as a result. The RFB is next, sitting between the M1A and the next two 308s on the list, the RSAS and the SR25, which perform roughly the same as each other. Then there is a significant drop down to the G28, which has a fairly disappointing result here, despite being quite solid in other categories. The SKS does get beaten out by the 308s for the most part, even though it has one of the better predictability scores relative to its caliber size and vertical recoil. The VPO 136 and 209 are fairly middle of the pack. Then we have the 556 and 545s bundled together towards the bottom, all scoring around the same. These are the lowest vertical recoil weapons, so this is not really too unexpected. At the bottom, we find the SVD, the SVT, and the VPO Hunter, with the SVT and VPO Hunter being the worst performers. We can also look at the relationship between predictability and vertical recoil, which I alluded to earlier. And this gives us an idea of how easy fast follow-up shots are to make, as low vertical recoil and good predictability means it's going to be a very user-friendly experience to shoot the gun. The loud SKS absolutely wins this, sitting at 53 vertical recoil, which is barely higher than the lowest vertical recoil guns in the 556 and 545s, and with a significantly better predictability than the 556 and 545s. The suppressed SKS is not far behind, along with the TX15, the SAG, and the ADAR. Then the SR25, repping the 308s, sneaks just past the short SAG, interestingly. Then we see more of the 308s start mixing in with the 556 and 545s. It's mostly the long-barreled loud 308s, due to what we talked about earlier, that the 308s have a problem with reducing recoil while suppressed, due to shorter barrels being preferred for better ergo when using a suppressor, and the loud muzzle attachments having better recoil reductions than the suppressors, which is somewhat opposite of 556 and 545, where suppressors are generally the best recoil reduction attachments. The G28 again struggles, it just has too bad predictability, even though its vertical recoil is actually very good. A lot of these same losers here with the SVD, SVT40, and VPO Hunter sitting at the bottom, with the MK18 going from first to last due to its massive recoil. The RFB also, despite a very good predictability, drops to the bottom third due to very high recoil. Next, we are going to look at time to reset, which refers to how quickly the weapon resets to your original point of aim after you fire a bullet. All the testing was done in the same time frame, so no skills have had an uneven impact on the weapons and therefore the results. The way I timed this was to build each of the weapons to spec, then I took them into the hideout range and I fired a set of 5 rounds. I recorded this and then put the clips into video editing software and went frame by frame to time the amount of frames from when the weapon was fired to when it was recentered. If the timing was consistent between those first 5 shots, I left it there, but if the timing was inconsistent for a weapon, I did another 5 shots and in some cases up to 15 total shots to average from. The guns obviously rise from the recoil when firing, then they go back down but overswing slightly before rising back up and settling back into center. And there's a point right there where the sway goes from recoil sway and settles into the regular aim sway again. And at that point, as best as I could perceive it on video, is when I considered the gun reset. There is obviously a decent margin of error here due to the frames of the video not perfectly reflecting the actual time due to being 60 FPS footage. Also, there is some inconsistencies between the shots in terms of time to reset, likely just due to animation inconsistencies. This seemed to only vary about a frame or so very minor, but still. So between it being based on video footage, the inconsistencies inherent in the game, and me and the human error I introduce, I would estimate the margin of error to be about 1 to 2 frames. This was tested using recoil neutral ammo, as different ammo types will increase or decrease recoil of a weapon in a lot of cases, like M61 adding +3 recoil, M855 having +5, etc. So to not have any impact from ammo, however small, we fired ammo that is neutral, so that it as directly as possible reflects the weapon's performance. The results here are quite interesting and definitely surprised me. The results are very close for most of the weapons, especially considering the margin of error. And this I did not expect. Recoil values seem to have a mild impact on the overall trend, but this isn't completely the case. The long sag is one of the winners at 48 frames, but also very interestingly the RFB. And the result between these two weapons leads me to think it's not entirely decided by recoil, and maybe a hidden stat in combination with recoil. Because at over 2 times the recoil of the sag, the RFB has the same 48 frame long time to reset. So the RFB is definitely an anomaly compared to the overall trend. There are a handful of other outliers and coincidentally losers like the M1A, which sit at around 5 frames higher than most of the other weapons. Same with the SVDS, the VPO Hunter and VPO 209. The SVT is the definitive loser here at 66 frames, which is well over a second. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to test the MK18 as I don't have it available in-game at the moment, but I would speculate this to be the actual loser if we go off of recoil being a factor. So it seems like the game wants you to compensate for the recoil, and the recoil being the main thing that you need to counter, as time to reset actually doesn't seem to be a major factor at all. Because if you had time to reset scale significantly off of your recoil, then the SVD, for example, having over double the recoil of a SAG, would have double or at the very least significantly longer time to recenter. So this is maybe an attempt to prevent high recoil weapons from having too much of a disadvantage compared to lower recoil weapons, as they are already at a disadvantage from just having more recoil, even though you would think that the more per shot recoil a weapon has, it would take you longer to recenter your aim. When testing a bit to see the influence of recoil, we found that the stock SAG, as a test subject, had a time to reset of 51 frames, which is the same as the meta G28, which is obviously 308, but is actually around the same vertical recoil as the stock unmodded SAG at 64 for the loud G28. So it seemed to not really be determined by caliber, but vertical recoil seems to be, at the very least, very central. The loud G28 and the RSAS have the same vertical recoil, but the G28 has a decent bit more horizontal. The G28 also has a slightly higher time to reset than the RSAS, so total recoil could potentially be a factor here and not just vertical. There isn't really a massive impact on time to reset from recoil for most of the weapons within the category. The G2867 recoil suppressed is performing very close in terms of time to reset as the long sag suppressed does at only 48 vertical recoil. I therefore, out of curiosity, tested the 9mm vector at 29 vertical recoil to see if there is some diminishing returns here, and it had a time to reset of 43 frames. So there is a benefit, however small, to an even lower vertical recoil in terms of time to reset. But this could also be due to other characteristics of the vector, like the fact that it is an SMG obviously, and could potentially have some other hidden factors coming into play because of that. It was just a good alternative to get a significantly lower vertical recoil to see if there was an impact, which there seems to be. I think the game kind of fools you into thinking there is a bigger difference in time to reset between the guns, likely just due to how higher recoil affects the feel of a weapon. But in conclusion, this is practically irrelevant between most of the weapons, and what is likely instead going to make the weapon feel different in terms of follow-up shots is things like per-shot recoil, the predictability of said recoil, which is the relationship between vertical and horizontal, and the amount of aim sway, which is determined by Evo Ergo, as a low ergo weapon can easily feel like it's taking longer to reset because of the increased movement it has before settling, and it's also a more gradual transition. But this was a very, very unexpected result overall. So next up is Ergo, and Ergo is a little bit of a tricky stat in Tarkov because it affects things like ADS time, stamina drain while aiming, aim sway, and the sound made from aiming down sights. And the game doesn't tell you, but your ergo is also negatively affected by the weight of your weapon and the weight of the attachments on that weapon. And this means that the weight of suppressors, sights, stocks, etc. will have an effect on your actual ergonomics, not just the plus or minus to raw ergo that is listed on those attachments. Your weapon might have good raw ergo, but if the weapon weighs 8 kilos, it's likely to perform badly despite its raw ergo. Therefore, we are going to be using something called Evolved Ergonomics, which is a stat developed by the creators of the website DB for Tarkov. And this calculates your real or effective ergonomics by subtracting the weight penalty from your raw ergonomics. It is also important to know here that there is an exponential benefit to high raw ergo, so if you have a low ergo weapon, weight is the deciding factor for your Evo Ergo, which is your real ergonomics. But if you have a high amount of ergo, like 70 or 80, weight has less of a negative effect on your Evo Ergo, or your real ergo. This is why certain guns, like the SAG AKs for example, has a decent Evo Ergo or real ergonomics, despite being very heavy guns at around 6 kilos. Because their base raw ergo is so high, their modded raw ergo is very high, and this therefore cancels out some of the negative effects of the weight of the weapon, although not entirely, like with stamina drain while aiming, which we'll see a little bit later. Now, the lighter calibers are for the most part going to take the top placings here, mainly just due to being lighter guns on average. The TX15, 8R, SAG, SAG Short, and the VPO 209 take the top 5, all loud. The short SAG places at the top of the suppressed, the TX15, SAG long, and 8R close behind. The loud SKS places as the best 7.62, the SR25 with a 16-inch barrel is the best 308. The loud G28 is also up there, and the loud VPO Hunter, funnily enough. The bottom half is mainly the rest of the 308s, both loud and suppressed, as well as the suppressed 7.62s and the 54Rs like the SVD and SVT. The MK18 is the loser, which is understandable at 8.5 and over 9 kilos in weight for loud and suppressed. If we consider both loud and suppressed performance of the other guns, then the SVD is the loser, with the loud SVD barely having a positive Evo Ergo at 0.9, and therefore also barely keeping itself above overswing even unsuppressed. Because if you have a negative Evo Ergo, you will experience something called overswing when aiming down sights, which is when your gun will swing past your point of aim before coming back to center when you aim in. This is a big negative and something you want to avoid wherever possible. For this next part, we are going to look into the general effect of Ergo and what gameplay elements it benefits, as well as some of the other weapon stats. So we'll look at ADS times, both with stock mags and with an alternative mag, as well as arm stamina duration. We'll also take a look at magazine sizes and the effect of alternate magazines on Evo Ergo and ADS times. We'll also take a look at reload times, even though Ergo doesn't affect this. This is a set timer that is only influenced by your weapon skills, like your DMR skill, for example. ADS time includes overswing if there is any, and was timed from animation start, which we can see from the stamina bar changing until the aim settles into regular aim sway, similar to how we tested time to reset earlier. I am also using a hold breath macro to get as clear of a result as possible. This also means there is no difference in hold breath input between the guns either. This is also based on video footage, like all these tests are, and this being based on video as well as the inconsistencies in the game and the human error I introduce, there is a decent margin of error here as well. For ADS, there is a significant jump in ADS time due to the overswing introduced for reaching negative Evo Ergo, but this caps out at about 1.15 to 1.2 seconds or so for most of the weapons, seemingly due to just diminishing returns from negative Evo Ergo. I was unable to test the MK18 in-game as I don't have it at the moment, so the ADS time and reload time on that gun is averaged from a handful of YouTube videos, so take that one with an extra pinch of salt. For the most part, the results correlate well with Evo Ergo, especially considering the margin of error here, which I would easily put at 0.02-ish seconds. Arm stamina is a much more straightforward and accurate test though, simply how long can you hold ADS in a standing position until your stamina bar depletes. The arm stamina was tested with level 17 strength. Interestingly, arm stamina drain while aiming down sight doesn't seem to perfectly correlate with Evo Ergo. While Ergo and Evo Ergo obviously does have an impact, they seem to only be part of the equation, because it seems that weight has a significant impact directly on the result here, not just through Evo Ergo. Where light weapons like the TX-15 and 8R get significantly less stamina drain than heavy weapons like the SAG AKs, despite not having significantly different Evo Ergo. Reload times were also tested from the animation starts, which is signaled by the reloading voice line prompt popping up, until the weapon could fire, by just spamming left click until it shot at the animation finish. This one probably has the biggest margin of error. The game is unfortunately quite inconsistent, probably due to the fact that we talked about with fire rate that the game doesn't have a buffer on the fire function, so only the first input after the animation finishes actually triggers the shot. The reload time testing was done with level 3 skill in DMR and level 16 skill in assault rifles, and these skills will decrease the reload times by 0.4% per level, so keep that in mind. These times are for the stock mags that I've used with the builds. There doesn't seem to be a longer reload for 60 rounders compared to 30 rounders, for example, so mag size doesn't seem to impact reloads any. Even though I did not test every single magazine, I only tested a few of the common big magazines that are used as alternate magazines in this video. We also looked at the magazine sizes available and the impact on Evo Ergo from alternative magazines. So some weapons only have 1 to 2 options for magazines, while others have a lot more. And magazine size is arguably a lot less important when using a DMR or a single fire rifle in general than with an assault rifle or an SMG, but I think it's worth at the very least a mention, especially to have a look at the Evo Ergo penalties from using bigger or alternative magazines. As we can see, there is a significant Evo Ergo hit from going to bigger magazines across the board. Almost half the weapons on this list is in overswing with an alternative mag, and besides the SVD, that alternative mag is a bigger mag than the stock mag. So the DMR / single fire rifle category is very vulnerable to overswing when using big magazines. But this is mainly a problem with the bigger caliber DMRs like the 308s. Again, there isn't really the same incentive to use big magazines for this category of weapons, but I think it's a good thing to be aware of in case you do get tempted to run them. A lot of the weapons have good options for magazines, ranging from 10 to 75 or even 100 for the 5.56, 5.45 or 7.62s. The 308s are more mixed. Some have great options all the way up to 50 rounders like the SR25, RSAS or M1A. The RFB has 3 options, but the G28, for example, only has 2 options, 10 and 20. Others like the SVD, VPO Hunter and SVT40 also just have 2 options. So if you're not a fan of reloads, then the smaller calibers are the way to go. They will also, generally speaking, handle the Evo Ergo penalty of bigger magazines better as well, this being balanced out by having a lower damage output compared to 308s, obviously. The G28 is probably the most relatively disadvantaged gun, as it doesn't have 50 rounders, but also doesn't even have 25 or 30 rounders available, which the other 308s do. Next, we are going to look at how this Evo Ergo affects how a gun handles and how quickly it can snap to target and then deliver controlled fire on that target. This handling stat uses a weapon's ADS time, which is derived from a weapon's Evo Ergo, and IBC, initial burst controllability, to represent how controllable a weapon is to fire during that initial burst after having snapped to target. This stat rewards weapons with high Evo Ergo and good controllability. The weapons that score high on handling are therefore likely to be experienced as more user-friendly. The TX15 wins out here, loud and suppressed, the loud with a very good ADS time and the suppressed with the lowest vertical recoil on the list. The SAG AKs, both long and short, are also performing very well. They are relatively close to each other in ADS time and all very good in terms of recoil and are quite closely grouped up as a result. The 8R is solid here, doing a bit worse than the TX and the SAGs. The SKS is also high on the list, barely behind the 8R. The VPO 136 does get beaten out by the SKS of the 7.62s, although not by much. The SR25 loud 20-inch barreled is the best 308, the 16-inch version barely getting beaten by the G28. The G28 is giving us a good showing here, having a very competitive vertical recoil and placing as the second 308 with the RSAS on a close third. This order is the same for the top 3 suppressed 308s, the SR25 first, then the G28 followed by the RSAS third. The VPO 209 is performing quite middle of the pack, nothing special, very similar between suppressed and unsuppressed, with the loud having better ergo and ADS times and the suppressed having better recoil. The 308 losers are the VPO Hunter, M1A and RFB. They're all fairly awkward weapons to use, falling quite low due to having the same problem of fairly high recoil while also being heavy and or low on ergo. The M1A is a brutal 7 kilos and only manages 88 vertical recoil at the cost of those 7 kilos. The SVD also really struggles, to no surprise, having massive ergo issues, both loud and suppressed, and very high recoil. The MK18 is the loser proper though, heavy, low ergo, high recoil. Yeah, it just lost that race before it even got out of bed. Next up, we have damage. So like I said in the recoil part of the video, we are going to assume a static 450 RPM across the weapons in this video, which is the semi-automatic hard cap. This allows us to calculate DPS and time to kill values, and the important thing in this case is that the results are relative, so the relative relationship between the weapons are there. But obviously, if you click slower than the 7.5 clicks per second that is assumed, which is very likely, your damage output will obviously be lower, and this is just the theoretical max. But since the RPM is dynamic in actual gameplay, and even the delay between individual shots might vary, it's impossible to actually get a gameplay value accurate for time to kill, so keep that in mind. Therefore, the arguably more useful stat to show the damage output of the weapons is the number of shots to kill. For the DMRs and single-fire rifles, I think it's fairly useless to look at DPS, as it's a fairly redundant stat when we already have shots to kill and time to kill, and leg meta and raw DPS isn't really viable in the way it is for automatic rifles and SMGs, so we are going to skip spending any time on DPS for this weapon category. We are going to look at something called timed cumulative chance of kill, which is simply put, how many bullets do we need to achieve a 90% chance of having killed our target, and then how fast can the different guns fire that amount of bullets. This cumulative chance of kill is based on the ballistic simulator on tarkovgunsmith.com. We are going to test this against multiple different armor configurations as well, 5+2, 6+3, 4+3, etc. This refers to the level of the plate in the armor, followed by the level of the soft armor. So 5+2 is a level 5 plate in a body armor or rig with level 2 soft armor. As the plate and the soft armor are two different individual layers the bullet has to penetrate. In Tarkov, armor has what we will call a armor rating, which is 10 times its level, so a level 5 plate has 50 armor rating. How effectively you can penetrate the armor depends on the ammo's penetration value in relation to this armor rating. So if you have a low relative penetration value, so less than 40 pen against level 5 armor for example, then almost all the damage gets blocked, meaning you need to wear down the armor plate first before you start doing any impactful damage. Then the higher the penetration, the more damage you gradually do, all the way until you are at around 13 penetration more than the armor rating, which would be around 63 pen against level 5 armor. At this point, the bullet effectively reaches its full potential and damage plateaus, meaning higher penetration beyond this point offers no significant benefit. There is never 100% damage blocked at low penetration values due to blunt damage throughput always being a thing, and there is never 0% damage blocked at high pen values since some partial mitigation still happens. And while this is an oversimplification of the system, this is in essence how it works. There are also a lot of other things that come into play with the armor system, like durability, blunt damage, armor material, etc., the amount of nuance in the ballistics in general with damage and ammo and health systems and body parts and fragmentation, etc. It's so massive. So the results are therefore from the start bound to be an oversimplification. It is just to give us some idea of the killability for each weapon. We will take a look at the relative drop-off between the weapons in its own stat later on, so how much damage, penetration, and velocity drops off in terms of pure numbers. We will also take a quick look at damage drop-off in regards to shots to kill and by extension time to kill, but we aren't going to get lost in the weeds on this. So we'll have a look at it for 5+2 armor. That should be enough to give us some idea of how damage drop-off works and can tell us a little bit about the different ammo. Most ammo does carry a significant amount of their damage value for quite a long distance, so while it does matter for regular body shots, yes, it is quite minor, and because of how Tarkov's damage system works, it has a very gradual impact on the kill chance. There are only a few hard cutoffs, which means we are talking about 10, 20, 50, or even 100 meters only influencing the chance of kill by a matter of a few percent. So take M61 for example against 5+2 armor. It goes from a 90.3% chance of 2 shots to kill at 0 meters, but only drops to an 84.5% chance of a 2-shot kill at 100 meters, which is only a 5% kill chance difference over 100 meters. So the impact is relatively small, but in some situations, depending on ammo and armor and all the other possible variables, it can matter a lot more. A good example of that is 5.56 with M855A1, where at 100 meters, it clearly increases to 6 bullets for a 90% chance of kill. This is because M855A1 only has 44 penetration compared to M61 having 55, so it's much sooner going to drop into struggle territory against level 5 armor in this case. But at 50 meters, M855A1 still maintains a 88% chance to 5-shot kill, as it is keeping itself decently above 40 penetration still. Because of this, I feel there is little point for us to get lost in the sauce of damage drop-off, as its impact is relatively small at the shorter ranges. And it's only really at the shorter ranges that you would spam shots center mass and get consecutive shots to land on someone's front plate, which is what would make this sim accurate and valuable. And with a caliber like 5.56 needing 5 shots, even at close ranges, that is a big ask. And you're also realistically going to start controlled tapping and going for headshots the moment you start reaching 50+ meters, meaning simulating against body armor is kind of useless at that point. And therefore damage drop-off against body armor doesn't really provide us with super useful information. Instead, we are going to look at how damage drop-off affects our ability to kill with headshots at range a little bit later in the stat called headshot kill range, which is much more relevant for the DMRs and single-fire rifles. When considering the ammo to test all of this with, we have what we'll call tier 1 ammo, which is the quote-unquote best ammo, usually just meaning highest penetration ammo, that you can buy or craft yourself for that caliber. And while there obviously exists better ammo than this tier 1 ammo as found in Raid, this is the best widely available ammo for that caliber. And then we have tier 2 ammo being the ammo second to this. Sometimes this is ammo that you can buy straight from the flea market, but not always. It varies from caliber to caliber, where ammo like 545 BT can be bought straight from the flea, but M80 is locked to a trader, as an example. Like we just talked about, shots to kill is really the important part here, as we are assuming the same fire rate as these are semi-automatic weapons. When going against 5+2 armor, the MK18 one-shots and as a result wins, but it is also a little bit of an exception given that it doesn't really have a time to kill effectively because it one-shots. Besides the MK18, the 308s and M61 is the absolute winner at 2 shots to kill, just like with the fully automatic assault rifles in the last video. It is nice to know that this does increase to 3 shots only after about 10 meters or so, because the range does affect the different ammo and its damage. Also, because the amount of bullets here is based on getting a 90% chance to kill, this means that even though M61 needs 3 bullets to achieve a 90% chance to kill after 10 meters, there is still about a 89% chance at 25 meters, let's say, that 2 shots are still enough to kill. We just have to draw the line somewhere, and in this case it's at 90%, so keep that in mind. It is not a hard requirement for that exact amount of bullets to kill a target, but that's the amount of bullets you need to have a 90% chance of killing your target. BT also needs 2 shots, also increases quite early to 3, but at 20 to 25 meters, so a little bit later than M61. 762 BP needs 4 shots and actually doesn't climb to 5, it stays comfortably at a 4 shots to kill up to 75 meters, after which this stat is pretty much no longer relevant, like we talked about earlier, and we'll take a look at a more useful stat a bit later in the video in headshot kill range. M80 takes 4 shots as well against level 5 plus 2, and it has a breakpoint around 20 to 25 meters, where it afterwards needs 5 shots to manage a 90% kill chance. APM also starts at 4 shots to kill, but after 40 to 50 meters it needs 5 shots to manage a 90% kill chance, and the 5.56 and 5.45s are the losers at 5 shots to kill. Interestingly, 5.56 is the loser at range, as it goes from the already bad 5 shots to kill up to 6 shots after 30 to 40 meters, while 5.45 has this breakpoint at 50 to 60 meters. Again, these shots to kill are not hard requirements, but estimates due to how the game calculates damage. So in effect, there is very little difference between these two calibers. 5.56 just has a slightly more unfavorable drop-off, and as a result drops below 90% kill chance with 5 bullets earlier than 5.45. If we look at some other armor levels as well, we'll get some interesting results. Going to 5+3 armor, the different calibers largely actually stay the same. So level 3 soft compared to level 2 soft, while there is a difference, it is rather small. The only caliber that really takes a hit here is 366, with APM going from 4 to 5 shots to kill. If we look at some lower tier armors, the 5.56 and 5.45s are definitely the ones improving the most when we go against 4+2 or 4+3 armor. They drop all the way down to 3 shots to kill for 4+2. Interestingly, 5.56 actually need 4 shots to kill against 4+3 armor, even though just barely, while 5.45 is actually comfortably only needing 3. So 5.56 again performing slightly worse than 5.45. Again, the differences here are very minor, even though 5.56 needs 4 shots to remain above 90% chance of kill against 4+3, it's still at 85% plus chance of kill with 3 shots. M61 and BT don't really see any improvement, as they are already effectively penetrating the armor very well, but they are kind of locked to a 2 shots minimum because 1 bullet doesn't have enough flesh damage to kill the target in 1 shot. M80 needs 3 shots against both 4+2 and 4+3 armor, but against 4+2, 2 shots are almost hitting a 90% kill chance. Now, if we take a look at the highest end armor you can wear, being a level 6 plate with level 3 soft armor, and keep in mind, increased armor levels are fairly consequential because we are on single fire rifles, and the fire rate is lower, meaning each bullet has a way bigger impact on time to kill. When going with a level 6 plate, we can see that some of the tier 1 ammo takes 1 bullet more compared to level 5. But interestingly, the tier 2 ammo doesn't change. And this is because this ammo just lacks the pen to do any significant damage through the armor. So instead, it relies on zeroing out the armor plate to then deal damage, bypassing it when its durability is decreased or zeroed. And since both level 5 and 6 plates are outside the effective penetration range of these tier 2 ammos, they are in effect equal, since in both cases the plate needs to be worn down. So arguably for lower tier ammo, the durability of the plate you are shooting at matters more than its actual armor level. Now the SVD with 54R is very interesting, as it has an insanely high percentage of its penetration damage dealt as armor damage, meaning that it is very reliant on wearing down armor before it can effectively deal damage through it. This also means it still takes 4 shots against level 6, but if you have a low durability level 6, it can take 3 shots, which is less than the 4 shots needed for 60 durability 5+2 armor, which is very interesting. And another case where ammo is more dependent on an armor's durability than its actual level. Now, damage drop-off, like we talked about a bit earlier, is a very interesting topic. Unfortunately, it's just very difficult to present anything useful from the data. It is interesting on paper info, but it has little usefulness in real gameplay. And gameplay situations are so dynamic, and there are tons of factors influencing the result you'll have, in addition to damage drop-off. But what we can do is look at the general value drop-off for the different weapons. We have looked at this in the form of how much damage, penetration, and velocity that has been lost over 100 meters and over 200 meters. So the closer this number is to 1, the better the weapon and its ammo has retained its damage, penetration, and velocity at those ranges. The winner is 338 Lapua out of the MK18, beating out the second place and anything lower by quite a margin actually. The VPO Hunter interestingly also does really well, so does the SVD and SVT. Interestingly, these are the on average worst performers in the other categories. Of the competitive weapons for the overall, the top 308s are really the highest placers, like the G28, the RSAS, and the SR25. As we can see, the heavier rounds actually maintain their values better, which is very interesting, and the lighter calibers like the 5.56 and 5.45s are the worst performers. This is especially interesting as the 5.56 and 5.45s are the fastest calibers in terms of muzzle velocity at around 900 meters a second, while 308 and 7.62 have a decently lower velocity at around 800 meters per second. So there is a much more aggressive drop-off for 5.56 and 5.45, and this is even more evident when looking at 200 meters, where the lighter calibers have lost about 20% of their original values. However, 7.62 isn't performing much better than 5.56 and 5.45, even while being a bigger caliber, and it sits just above 5.45 out of the SKS and is actually beaten by the 5.45s when shot from the VPO 136. So all the typical assault rifle calibers are all close to each other at the bottom of the list. 366 APM also has a similarly bad drop-off, but APM is a little bit unique, like we'll see in the 90% headshot kill range next, where because it's only 42 penetration, this drop-off affects it particularly badly. Now, we have looked at time to kill, and we have touched on damage drop-off there. We have also looked at damage drop-off in raw values, but now I want to take a look at a place where I think damage drop-off is the most important, which is when going for headshots. After a certain range, you are not realistically going to be tapping center mass anymore. It will just be too inconsistent, and the enemy player is not just going to stand there and let you land consecutive shots on his front plate. So after 50 meters, maybe more, maybe less, depending on the weapon, it is way more effective to go for accurate, deliberate shots and try to land a headshot rather than just spamming center mass. Because of this, we'll instead look at what range a weapon can maintain a 90% chance of kill with a headshot against a level 4 helmet. This is based on the last 10 meter interval that you have a 90% chance of kill at, so the meter value here is not accurate to the meter, so keep that in mind. The results here are mainly a result of the ammo and only minorly affected by the weapon platform. The 5.56 and 5.45s perform fairly similar in this, with 5.45 BP actually beating out 5.56 M855A1, even just by 10 meters. And if we look at the differences between 5.56 M856A1 and 5.45 BT in the Sims as well, we can see that between these very similar rounds, there is still a significant difference in one-shot headshot chance of kill, where M856A1 has about a 10% higher chance of killing through level 4 helmets. And this is entirely thanks to M856A1 having one more armor penetration than 5.45 BT, which is kind of the opposite as with M855A1 and 5.45 BP, where BP has one more pen than M855A1, which is what's letting 5.45 BP maintain more damage at range compared to M855A1, even if just slightly. 338 FMJ is actually beaten by M61 in 90% chance of kill headshot range, which is thanks to M61 having 55 pen, which is decently more than the 47 of the 338 FMJ, meaning it does way better against level 4, and it also maintains that effectiveness for way longer. But 338 FMJ does beat out M61 in 0% headshot kill range due to it just having so much more raw damage, therefore maintaining some chance of a kill for a longer distance. The 308s with M61 have a huge lead here, and while never being a guaranteed headshot kill, there are always at the very least a few % chance of needing more than one shot, it will be more consistent as it manages to maintain its 90% chance of kill all the way out to 550 meters. For M80, it actually performs the same as 5.45 BP. It maintains a 90% chance of kill up to and including 110 meters. 54R BT out of an SVD is slightly worse than 308 M61, but also slightly better if fired from the SVT 40. 762 BP is around 200 meters from a VPO 136 and 220 meters fired from an OP SKS. The 366 APM though drops below 90% just after 60 meters, which was a bit surprising, but it's low velocity and it has just 42 pen, and therefore it doesn't take a lot of range before it starts struggling against level 4. The MK18 with its 338 AP round just maxes out the sim at 2000 meters, which is fine because the real number would be ridiculous, so easily the statistical winner here obviously. Another interesting stat is at what range we no longer have any chance of getting a one-shot headshot, especially when we compare it to the 90% headshot kill range. So this is the range at which ammo has lost too much of its damage or penetration or both, that it no longer has the ability to do the 35 damage that is needed to kill with a headshot. The 5.56 and 5.45s actually drop out of being able to one-shot headshot through level 4 helmets, just one 10-meter interval after dropping below 90% headshot kill range. So it goes from good to bad really fast for these two calibers. The 308s and M61, on the other hand, doesn't entirely lose its chance to one-shot headshot until over a kilometer, at between 1000 to 1100 meters depending on the gun it's fired from. The APM is also fascinating here because it's lasting all the way out to about 1900 meters, likely due to just having such a high flesh damage, and because of that it maintains at least some chance for a very, very long time. M80 drops to 0% at about 550 meters, interestingly the same range as M61 drops below 90% headshot kill range. With the 308 M61 though, interestingly, it actually decreases in chance until about 50%, then it goes straight to 0 in the next 10 meters. With the 5.56 and 5.45s, it goes from about 90% or right under 90% straight to 0 as well. So there is a hard cutoff when you lose enough damage and pen, and then therefore you just mathematically cannot do the 35 damage you need to kill with a headshot. The 338 AP MK18 again just maxes out the sim here, so yeah. We can also take a look at the 80% headshot accuracy range. So how far out can you maintain a 80% chance of hitting a headshot with the given weapon? The MK18 takes the top placing at 818 meters. The 5.56s with the TX15 and 8R along with the long 5.45 SAG sit at a bit over 400 meters, the short SAG falling off earlier ending up at 279 meters. The 308s are more all over the place, the VPO Hunter easily the worst at 190 meters, but the rest ranging from the SR25 with a 16-inch barrel at 294 meters loud and 303 meters suppressed, up to the 22-inch RSAS at 577 meters. The SVD is sitting at 403 meters, so competitive with the best 308s, like the 20-inch barreled SR25, and not very far behind the 5.56 and 5.45s. The SKS doesn't really impress at just 262 meters, and the VPO 209 and 136 are the losers, both sitting at just 162 meters. The next stat is called Fast Accurate Shot to Target, and this stat is meant to give us an idea of how fast and accurate a weapon can be at a specific range. This is meant to represent the kind of scenario when spotting an enemy and needing to quickly and accurately fire at them, like when someone peeks you and you're not expecting them. So it looks at ADS time, MOA, and muzzle velocity. It weighs ADS very heavily in the short ranges, like 25 meters, and then gradually starts considering MOA and velocity more the further the range. So at 100 meters, MOA and velocity are very impactful, and at 200 meters even more so. And this is to reflect that ADS time is the main factor when fighting in close ranges, as MOA and velocity doesn't really matter that much when you're shooting a target 15 meters away, but at 100 or 200 meters, ADS time, while still a factor, is not as important as velocity and MOA. Because at 100 meters, it doesn't matter if you can ADS fast if you can't hit the target. The weapons do use their tier 1 PvP ammo in this test, which will potentially affect the accuracy somewhat, which is important to note, but I think they need to be considered with this factor included, because that's what gives us the most relevant comparison in terms of actual gameplay performance. No one is running around shooting 5.56 FMJ as their ammo of choice, at least hopefully. At 25 meters, the fast high Evo Ergo weapons win out to no surprise, like the TX, the 8R, and the SAG AKs. The 308s start coming in a little bit before halfway down the list. The short 16-inch SR25 takes the top 308. The G28 is not far behind. The MK18 loses this, also no surprise, with the heavier ergo troubled DMRs like the SVD, M1A, and RFB also struggling. At 50 meters, the SKS and the VPO starts dropping as they are relatively competitive on ADS times with the top weapons, but they have worse accuracy. The 308s are also barely climbing a little bit. At 75 meters, and the MOA and velocity really start having a big effect. The VPOs start crumbling, the 308s keep climbing, the 762s also keep falling further down the list. The loud SVD also starts making significant ground here. At 100 meters, the 556 and 545s are still dominating, the 545s with good muscle velocity and the 556s with slightly worse velocity but really good MOA. The RSAS is now the top 308 with its 22-inch barrel. It's very strong at range. And at 200 meters, it's becoming quite even. The 308s have climbed a lot and surpassed some of the 556 and 545s, not really due to the 556 or 545s falling off, but more thanks to the 308s coming up to speed thanks to good MOA. As the 308 velocity isn't really that impressive and decently lower than the 556 and 545s. The TX15 is the undisputed winner, having the loud first place at every range. The suppressed TX also wins overall, but is matched by some of the SAGs at 75 meters and below. Now, even though the 308s are beaten out by the smaller calibers here, this stat doesn't consider the killing power of the weapons. And while the 308s fall behind in accuracy and ADS time, they generally have greater damage output and maintain this damage output for a lot longer, like we saw in the damage part of the video when looking at damage drop-off and headshot kill chance. Now let's also take a look at how the weapons score in terms of overall very generalized accuracy by looking at just MOA and muscle velocity. Now the weapons do use their tier 1 PvP ammo in this test as well, just like with accurate shot to target. The MK18 gaps the other weapons here, mainly due to its very low MOA at 0.57, as its muscle velocity isn't very special at all. The 22-inch barreled RSAS is also very strong, also a low MOA carrying it at 0.81. Then we start getting to the rest of the guns, with the 556s being all grouped up, mainly as a result of using the same 16-inch Hansen barrel. They are followed by the long SAG, which is performing significantly better than the short SAG, not surprisingly. The long SAG has a barely worse MOA than the ADAR and TX15, but it actually beats them out in velocity. The SAG, both long and short versions, being the only ones that break 900 meters per second. I don't know how it makes sense that the short SAG with its shorter barrel achieves the same muscle velocity as the long SAG, but it is what it is. What's interesting is that this doesn't seem to be because of the ammo, which is 545 BP, but instead thanks to the AKs, and I'm going a bit off track here, the 556 AKs, the 101 and 102, also beat out the ADAR and TX15, having over 960 meters per second. The SVD scores quite solidly on accuracy. Unfortunately, it's one of the only areas where this gun actually does well. The 308s generally plays okay as a result of their good MOA and their velocity just being okay and nothing spectacular. The SKS also struggles with an even lower MOA than any of the 308s, and the losers are all of the VPOs with terrible MOA, and the VPO 209 also struggling with a very slow velocity. When looking at scoring the weapons overall, we'll do this with a normalized scoring system, where the weapons are given a score from 0 to 1 on how they perform compared to the best and worst in that given category. And this allows us to look at the relative relationship of the weapons, which is the most fair way to evaluate them. We've delved into the specific categories exactly so that we could see the non-normalized relationship between the weapons as well. We are also going to consider only select categories to try and give a well-rounded evaluation. We're going to include CFC, or continuous fire controllability, to represent controllability directly. We'll include follow-up shots in the form of predictability compared to vertical recoil, and we'll include reload times, which, while a more secondary aspect of the gun's performance, is arguably a very important one. We'll also include handling to reward weapons who achieve a good balance of both good ergo and good recoil, and Evo Ergo will be included for the overall general impact of ergo on the weapon's performance, as well as covering the impact of weight, at least for the most part. Time to kill both for tier 1 ammo and tier 2 ammo is included, representing the general damage output, but we'll also have the 90% headshot kill range included due to how important headshots are when using a single fire rifle. And finally, we have accuracy to represent the general accuracy of the weapon over range in the form of MOA and muzzle velocity. Looking at the overall results, the loud RSAS with a 22-inch barrel takes first place, thanks to it just being good at almost everything. Its weakest area is arguably Ergo and Evo Ergo, but even here it's far from the worst. The TX15 is the runner-up, first loud, then suppressed interestingly. The suppressed beats out a lot of the top loud weapons, likely due to its very low recoil, at just 46 vertical, and places as the best suppressed weapon. The 20-inch barreled SR25 is the second 308 behind the RSAS, consistently being one of the strongest 308s in the various categories we have looked at, only really beaten by the RSAS in terms of accuracy and reload times. The 8R is also close to the top here, performing very similarly to the TX15 in most of the categories, but falling behind in terms of recoil and controllability. The G28 also finishes high on the list as the third place 308, a solid gun in all the categories making up the overall score, being consistently in the top 3 of the 308s, but with some drawbacks in the minor categories, which we didn't actually include in the overall, like mag size, where the G28 has very limited options. The first SAG is the long SAG at 9th place, which I was expecting more from, to be honest. I really like the SAG AKs and I think they're great to use, so a little bit unexpected that they struggle to compete with the top weapons. They do fall slightly behind the TX15 and 8R in most of the categories. They also have a decently longer reload time, and that's enough for them to drop a bit on the overall. There is generally a good spread of 556, 545, and 308 in the top half of the placings. The first 762 though is the SKS down at 16th place. The SKS does some things very well, like predictability. It also has a relatively low recoil, which in combination makes it great for follow-up shots, and with its very decent Evo Ergo, it's a good user-friendly weapon. It's better than 556 and 545 on 90% headshot kill range, but it doesn't perform anything special in terms of time to kill. It also has a very long reload, which is costing it dearly. It also just isn't very accurate. All the 762s are kind of in this middle part of the list. The lower half is where we find some of the losers amongst the 308s, like the RFB and M1A. The loud M1A does place a bit higher up on the list, but is still, along with the RFB and VPO Hunter, the worst 308s. The SVD and SVT isn't doing 54R any favors either, having good damage output but terrible recoil and ergo, and therefore placing poorly on the overall. The MK18 is the overall worst weapon, its only redeeming quality being the fact that with 338 AP, it can one-shot 2 thorax, which is really strong, and potentially makes up for all its deficiencies, depending on who you are. But that's all I had for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this deep dive on the DMRs and semi-automatic rifles. Let me know what you think about the results. If you have any constructive criticism, I'd be glad to hear it, so post that in the comments. The next video in this series will be on SMGs, which I'm very excited about. Hopefully you are as well. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.